You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Federal funding for research from the National Science Foundation is being awarded at the slowest rate in 35 years, according to an investigation from the New York Times. Since the start of Trump's second term, cuts to National Institutes of Health and NSF grants have totaled more than $1.5 billion, according to the research publication Science. Republicans have justified these cuts by claiming the administration is rooting out wasteful spending or left-wing ideology run amok. And these attacks, along with the threats of funding freezes for universities, have reportedly created a culture of fear for researchers. It's left scientists wondering, do I speak up about what's happening, or do I stay quiet in hopes my funding might be restored? One Seattle researcher with lots of experience in political communication and information systems is saying, you have to speak up. Kate Starbird is the co-founder of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. She's also a professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, and she joins me now in studio. Kate, thanks for being back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really, really happy to be here.
So I just wanted to quote from Science, again, to lay the groundwork for this conversation. Amid these funding cuts, scientists who might once have welcomed public attention for their work or spoken up on issues affecting their field are instead opting for silence. Quote, the lived experience of a scientist right now is terrifying, said one prominent health researcher who asked not to be named out of concern for their funding, that they would be targeted. What do you make of the bind that scientists and researchers are in right now? How real is that fear, and how do you think they should respond?
I mean, it's a big question, and I think this is going to differ for every scientist based on, where they are in their career and other kinds of considerations. But I think the fear is real. But there's also a lot of uncertainty, and those things get intertwined. And maybe this has been changing over the course of the last few weeks, but initially we felt actions are being taken by the federal government to remove funding. It's a little haphazard. Some grants get canceled, some don't. It doesn't always make sense. And in that kind of in this kind of landscape, it's hard to know whether to draw attention to yourself, to be able to let people know what's going on, or whether you try to kind of keep your head down if you've got a couple of grants left to try to, maybe they don't see those grants. Maybe that grant keeps going and you can keep that student funded or that project going. And so I think there's a lot of just calculations about and being made individually often by researchers on whether or not to let people know what's happening or to try to keep your head down. And the fear is real. I think drawing attention to yourself can make it less likely that you can maintain your grant funding. But what we've also seen is that the cancellations have happened to pretty much everybody. I think that for those of us that have tenure, for those of us that have security in our jobs as much as you can in this environment, I think it's our responsibility to just to let the public know what's happening, what the impacts are going to be, what's going to change around, the projects, the hospitals, the science that's going on and how that's going to impact people's lives. I think it's really important for us to let people know this is happening. But I do understand that some researchers, especially researchers that are just getting started, it's maybe a better decision for them to kind of lay low and let those of us who can speak up. And for me, it's my responsibility to speak up. I have to. But my team really never had a choice. We've been the focus of negative criticism for years now, and so we've been speaking up and fighting back for a couple of years, and so we're kind of used to it.
So first, I want to get to that in just a second, but when you think about the damage being done right now and the need to speak up, what are your biggest concerns about what these cuts will do to science and research in America?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to quantify, right? It's hard to explain what's going to be lost when we basically turn off the innovation engine that's been happening in the United States through government funding of science since right after World War II. We start to get this movement right after World War II of scientists coming out of the war effort who begin to advocate for basic science and science to continue, not just for building weapons of war, but for building innovations and understandings that can then lay the foundations for a healthier, more vibrant society. And the U.S. science funding begins to kick in. In 1945, we start to get these advocates, Vannevar Bush and others, start standing up and advocating. And by the 1950s, you start to see funding begin to become more and more robust from the U.S. government. And that really builds this engine of science. U.S. universities become like these shining gems of innovation in the world and of science. And we really have benefited ever since. It's hard to say, like, okay, this one study came from that one government program, but I can pick up my phone and I can tell you the internet, search engines, social computing, everything about like the technology that we use every day, we can trace its roots to U.S. government funding right now. And AI, right? All of these things, we can show how U.S. government funding really like helped that innovation. I think someone who's in a different field like medical science could tell you about all of these breakthroughs about things that make our lives healthier and extend our life. All of these things tie back to U.S. government funding. And if you take that out, we're basically talking about stopping that engine or just, really just taking huge sections out and really slowing that down. And it means that the future of science and the future of innovation will lie somewhere else, not in the United States.
You have had experience with being targeted for your research, for the work that you've put out in the world. You mentioned, what happened around the 2020 election. You were hauled in front of Congress by Jim Jordan, the former Republican House Judiciary Chair. There was accusations that you were somehow a anti-First Amendment group or, something along those lines. How did you think about public engagement during that time and in the wake of that? How did that shape your decision on when and how to speak up? And how do you think about that today?
Yeah, so a little context there. I think our team had been doing research since 2012, 2013 on rumors and misinformation online. By 2015, we started to realize we're looking at disinformation that's really sinking into online systems. And in 2020, we started to use some of our research and apply some real-time methods that we were using to study rumors about election, especially rumors about election fraud. We documented how they spread. We did papers about, looking at who the actors were that were repeatedly spreading these rumors. And along with other researchers, we noted that there's a political asymmetry to rumors, not just about elections, but to misinformation online. There's a political asymmetry in terms of which parties are using it and how they're benefiting, particularly right-wing populists around the world are benefiting. As part of our research in 2020, we collaborated with a team of folks who were also kind of trying to help platforms figure out what election rumors are spreading and help, people kind of correct rumors in real time, especially rumors that would have caused people to maybe not be able to cast their vote due to wrong information about when and where to vote. So really, specifically, this one project was focused on elections. And as part of what I think an extension of false claims about the 2020 election and justification for January 6th. In about 2021, 2022, we see Republicans start coming after researchers like our team and others that were doing other kinds of research on online mis and disinformation and claiming that we're somehow part of a censorship project, which is honestly absurd, especially if you look at what they're doing now in terms of censoring speech everywhere that they can. And so at first we didn't know what to do. It came in waves of different kinds of attacks. First, it was sort of criticism and partisan media, and then we experienced a lot of public records requests, which were exhausting and are still going on today. We're still releasing new records today, 40 public records requests or something. We experienced lawsuits that are ongoing, and then we experienced congressional investigations. And the one thing that's really relevant today is when I went to give an interview, we voluntarily give an interview to Jim Jordan's Weaponization of Government Committee or something like that. He might have called it something different, but I think it's,
That was the gist.
That was the gist of it. I was in that meeting for 6 hours, was my testimony. We had questioning from sort of staff members from the Republicans and then the Democrats, and they would go back and forth. Jim Jordan showed up for about something under 10 minutes of that meeting. He kind of sneaked in. I didn't know he was there, and he asked a question, and I turned, and I thought it was one of his staff members sitting in that seat, but he switched seats, and it was Jim Jordan. And I look over, and he asked me one question, and that question was about my funding from the National Science Foundation. And so at that moment, that was 2023 in June, at that moment, I knew that Republicans were coming after funding from the National Science Foundation and others of researchers who were working in the field of misinformation. And I had been funded by the National Science Foundation since I was a PhD student at the University of Colorado. I had a graduate research fellowship there. I've had probably 5 to 10 somewhere different grants from the National Science Foundation since, studying online rumors, eventually looking at disinformation. None of that has anything to do with anything about censorship or any action of platforms. None of my research in the National Science Foundation ever sent anything to platforms or anything else to be labeled or moderated or what they call censorship. But that didn't matter. And so they wanted to define everybody who was doing research in this area as somehow part of a censorship industrial complex. And so our team has been aware, and folks in our small circle have been really paying attention, has been aware of an attack on this kind of research. So we were expecting, even if Donald Trump wasn't elected in 2024, we were expecting to be facing a really hostile environment for getting funding and mis and disinformation research from the government going forward. What we were not expecting is that they would use the same sort of tactics and those same sort of attacks to attack so many different research programs, whether it's research that is looking to increase participation in STEM education from underrepresented groups, or research that's looking to put guardrails on AI, research that's looking into information literacy of all kinds. All of those kinds of areas have been specifically targeted. And then we're also seeing just across the board cuts to research. I wasn't expecting that. And I think a lot of folks, I'm sorry I'm speaking so much. I don't think a lot of folks really understood what was happening to us. We tried to draw attention to it, not initially. Initially, we tried to hide our heads because we were told by communication specialists that's what you should do.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I'm curious about is because I know you've written on Blue Sky recently, that there was a time that you felt like keeping your head down, kind of not feeding the trolls, not, doing a lot of public engagement was somehow a defense against this. And you've since changed your mind. How did that come about? Yeah, I mean, initially when we started seeing just the partisan media attacks, it was the first thing we experienced. It was late summer of 2022. We started to see these attacks on us at hyperpartisan media. And at the time, it was an attack not just on me personally, but there were a few colleagues of mine at different schools and different companies and groups that were kind of seeing similar attacks. And some of them had more experience in public communications than I did. Some of them had been journalists. And they really said, it's really wise just to not give this any oxygen, right? There's this whole conversation of you don't give oxygen to these kinds of attacks. These are false conspiracy theories. It's best to just ignore them and they'll go away. It never sat right for me because first of all, I kind of could sense that these conspiracy theories were going to have legs just because I know a good conspiracy theory now because I've been studying them for so long. You should know. Yeah.
I know. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good one. And it resonates with a bunch of things that are already sort of conspiracy theory canon. And so I kind of knew that these ones were going to be effective. But, these other folks had more experience. And then you talk to communication professionals, and there was an old kind of strategy that if it's not in the Washington Post and it's not in the New York Times, don't draw attention to it. Well, it turns out, news to everyone, it's not, that a lot of things happen in this world. A lot of policy is made and a lot of decisions are made based on information that is not in the New York Times and the Washington Post. We have a new information ecosystem where you really do have to attend to what's happening in these hyperpartisan media outlets because that is shaping policy. These conspiracy theories are shaping policy. And I think it was the wrong decision back then in the fall of 2022 to try to ignore it and have it go away. And what we did was we failed to get the facts out. We failed to explain how these conspiracy theories were distorting the truth and misleading. And we failed in the fall, we failed in the winter. They were repeated in front of Congress in a congressional hearing before we ever put out a fact check, before we ever put out a refutation of these false claims. They had already been percolating around for months. They'd already launched lawsuits, and they were already, these false claims were already repeated in a congressional hearing. And so once that was out there, it was impossible to walk them back. There are people that are just absolutely convinced of these things that they had 6 months to let that kind of view of what was happening settle in before we got out any correction. And that was really just the wrong way to do it.
So that's kind of informed when you're looking at what's happening to the scientific community, to claims about the kind of research that's being cut. Oh, this is DEI left-wing stuff that's gone out of control. We need to rein this in. These are waste, fraud, and abuse cuts happening, especially the Doge cuts. Your argument now is if you can speak up, if you are in a position where you're not junior, you're not brand new, you're not concerned about your position at your research institution, that this is the time to speak. Is that, am I capturing that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for science generally, I think what we're communicating about might be different, but I think it's really important. There's this idea Maria Ressa told me about. She's a Nobel Peace Prize winner based on a lot of the work that she's done in the Philippines, but she was also sort of attacked for that work and politically vilified, and was under house arrest for one of the last times I talked to her. I think she's not in that situation anymore, but she's gone through a lot in order to try to defend the truth and get the truth out there. And she said, when there are falsehoods levied at you as an individual and organization, you have a short window of time to be able to counter those and get your message out. She called it the golden window, right? I think we're facing that right now. We have a window of opportunity as these changes are happening and as things are rolling out to communicate to the public about what's happening to us in universities, why that matters, what research funding is, and why that makes a difference in everyday people's lives. What the value of universities are for education and for research, and how these changes that are happening both on the research side and on the education side, we've got multiple dimensions of attacks on universities right now. It is critical, I think, for universities, for individual academics, for universities as a whole, to start doing that communication and to figure out ways to reach people so everyday people understand what's happening. You mentioned sort of the attacks on what they call DEI. I've got my
air quotes for the listening audience. Yes,
and I went over to a loved one's house, and I was having a conversation with them where they exist in a different information environment, and I said something about some of the defunded projects, and they were like, "Oh, that's just DEI," and I said, "Well, wait a minute. One of the projects is an organization that has helped women get into computing. We know women are underrepresented in computing, and it's just, it builds resources, it builds community. And it's actually one of the ways I got into academia was sitting at a luncheon from this organization where I met people, and they encouraged me to apply to go do a PhD. I was like, it's a great organization. And they're like, well, no, that's not what we meant. That's a good project. Those projects should continue. And I'm like, well, what about projects that help, kids that are underserved in the high school the high school I went to was down in Tacoma. What about projects that go out there and help those kids learn about engineering? Oh, no, those are good projects. I'm like, no, those are the ones that are getting cut. I think there's a lot of people that actually don't understand that this attack on what they call DEI actually means an attack on things that they care about, that they want to have happen in the world. They want, rural communities and kids that are underserved in urban communities as well. They want them to have opportunities, and they want, American science to have diversity of young people coming from different backgrounds. And I think we have to communicate that these attacks, these anti-DEI attacks, are actually undermining things that most Americans would say, oh, that's a good project.
But there's a structural problem with getting that information out, and I do want to talk about that in just a moment, because that's something that you've thought deeply about. First off, you mentioned Jim Jordan and the going after of National Science Foundation funding for you, what kind of repercussions have you or the Center for Informed Public seen besides the legal cases? Have you seen funding cuts? Have you seen direct pulling back of grants, things like that?
Yeah, this is a question. Everyone asks, "Are you all okay? Are you all okay?" We're fine. Everybody needs funding, right? We're going to need funding. I'm not going to tell all the funders that we might have that like we don't need help to keep going. We absolutely do. But we've prepared.
From an NPR perspective, don't never say that.
Yeah, right. We've been preparing for this moment of not being funded by the National Science Foundation anymore. We've known that's been coming since 2023, right? We've been aware, and so we've been, pursuing other kinds of options. We're really, been focused on philanthropic funding, and again, like our funding situation is not as good now as it was 5 years ago, but compared to my colleagues who had no idea this was coming, that are in other fields or that were doing work with underrepresented communities in STEM or whatever it is, we're much better off because we've been preparing for a moment that's like a post government funding moment. Again, we thought that was going to be laser focused on our project or our field. We had no idea it was coming for all of science. And again, there's multiple things that have happened here. Like some of it is like these certain grants have been canceled, but they're also trying to just greatly reduce the funding for each grant by taking away the indirects, which are super important for
funding
maintaining.
For keeping the lab lights on,
exactly.
Paying staff, yeah.
And that's for all science. And then they're just reducing the total number by 50%, right? And so there's just these massive cuts that are coming across in all of these different ways. And again, like at the Center for Informed Public, we've been preparing for that. And others of my colleagues, I went to a conference and so many people were like, "Oh my gosh, what's happening?" They're like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we've been pursuing these other options."
You're like the grizzled veterans telling these newbies like what the deal is.
Yeah, and it's as much as we tried to speak out, and as much as we tried to get our truth out, for the last 18 months or so, I think a lot of people like just didn't tune in because they didn't see how it was going to impact their lives, and I didn't see how it was going to impact their lives either. But people are all of a sudden like, "Oh my gosh, no, you've been seeing this for a while," and like, yeah, we have, and I don't know that we have perfect answers to how to navigate it, but we've learned what not to do in some cases, and are trying to apply that into sort of better strategies of communicating for sure.
You're listening to Soundside. That was Libby Dankman in conversation with Kate Starbird, co-founder of the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. I'm Jason Burrows. When we come back, Libby continues her conversation with Kate and digs into how misinformation and conspiracy theories are shaping our politics. That's in just a minute. Stick with us right here on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Jason Burrows, and we're continuing our conversation with Kate Starbird. Starbird is the co-founder of the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. She's also a professor of the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. She sat down with Soundside host Libby Dankman last Friday to discuss her work with the Center for an Informed Public. Here's Libby Dankman.
So I mentioned I want to talk about the structural challenges in our information space and when it comes to combating falsehoods. And that gets to this University of Washington faculty lecture that you gave earlier this year. It involves laying out the issues on the right and the left, the fact that there is a more fertile space for misinformation and disinformation on the right, and that's backed up by research in countries all over the world. In fact, and you mentioned the right-wing populism is more of a welcoming space for this type of misinformation and disinformation. And you have argued that what we're seeing here is that the populist right leverages something you label participatory disinformation. And it's something that you've also called the machinery of BS. We can't say the full term on the air.
That's a shame.
It is a shame, but everybody knows what BS is. So how does that work, this participatory disinformation, the machinery of BS?
Yeah, I think what I tried to do in that talk for the first 90% of it was really just to explain why the right in the United States and actually the populist right around the world has just been more effective at leveraging the participatory dynamics of this new media environment. And what that means is that, historically, if we looked at media, we would have, a newspaper or one source, and it would have, many, many people in the audience. We have this like hub and spoke kind of model, or like a broadcast model where we're speaking right now, and some number of people are hearing it. So a lot of people are hearing it.
But some people would call that like the top down style of
exactly.
the old traditional media. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the traditional media has this sort of top down style, but the modern media environment allows everyday people to participate in the construction of discourse, right? And 15 years ago, we talked about this dynamic democratizing media, that we would get out, that we would be able to kind of get away from having gatekeepers, that everybody would have a voice. So what we've seen is that the right has been better at sort of understanding these dynamics and taking advantage of them in a couple of different ways. And the left has largely in the United States, the left, and I mean Democrats and Democratic Party, have still tried to rely on the traditional media environment and the traditional media dynamics, and waiting for the New York Times to report on it and then criticizing the New York Times for not doing it correctly, whereas the right has sort of embraced an explicitly partisan and participatory model of media, whereas the left is still kind of trying to rely on ostensibly neutral, traditional media outlets that go from one to many.
That don't have an alignment with a political party. I mean, to be clear, NPR is viewed as probably center-left by a lot of people. We don't have a team where we're trying to get somebody elected in the way that the right-wing media is specifically right-wing. They are aligned right now with trying to get Donald Trump, elected or supported. And so I think in that way, that's an oversimplification of what you're saying. The left has simply not been developing these tools that the right has so effectively created in order to push the agenda.
Yeah, historically, traditional media was committed to telling sort of fact-based stories that were nonpartisan, right? And so the left in the United States and Democrats have relied on this sort of nonpartisan media that tells you sort of top-down stories and still kind of relying on gatekeepers, whereas the right has really coalesced around these sort of explicitly partisan and participatory media environments. And what that means is they're better at taking advantage of social media. They've set up all these hyper-partisan media outlets. Not they've set it up. These have sort of grown organically, and then they've embraced them. And what we've actually seen is that right-wing populists, and I said it earlier, that right-wing populists have done this, that they've just sort of accepted these dynamics. They've leveraged them very well. And what happened in the United States is the Republican Party sort of got pulled over by the right-wing populists, because the right-wing populists, probably for many reasons, but in part because these right-wing populists are so good at manipulating these information dynamics in this way. And I say manipulating, that's almost too hard of a word. Like, they've been great at exploiting them. One of the things we've seen is that influencers have risen in the place of what the traditional gatekeepers were journalists, right? And so we had this idea that new in social media were going to democratize information spaces, and that these, the gatekeepers would be replaced, everyone would have a voice. And what we've actually seen is that gatekeepers haven't been erased; they've been replaced by influencers, and influencers have a very different commitment to truth and into storytelling than journalists do. And so we've just got a very different kind of information environment that is mediated by a completely different kind of person. And the talk I gave actually shows how a lot of the influencers that have gained visibility in these information spaces have exploited the attention dynamics of social media. They've used outrage, they've used conspiracy theory, they've used rumors during breaking news events to gain attention, to gain followers, and then they leverage those followers for the next thing, and they can turn that into political points. They can turn that into financial gains, and so there's this intersection between the ways that these media ecosystems have developed and social media, how sort of a partisan media infrastructure has kind of manifested there, and how the populist right has really taken advantage of those conditions.
Why are Democrats and the left so bad at this?
I don't know the answer to that. I would say an over-reliance on traditional media has not helped in recent years, and you can still see that in so much effort being expended criticizing the New York Times coverage of things. I'm like, the New York Times is not going to serve for the left the same purpose that the Gateway Pundit serves for the right. That they're just not set up to do that.
But the left feels like a sense of betrayal, realizing that there is this developed information system on the right that they haven't been able to develop, and so they kind of are looking at journalists and saying, why aren't you doing this for us? I've experienced that as an NPR host, and it's not, we're journalists, we're trying to call balls and strikes. Our commitment is to the truth. Our commitment is not to get somebody elected, a certain political party elected. And so if Democrats want that, you know what I mean, that's not up to journalists. And so I think that's become this weird dynamic where the right has sort of abandoned the media. And in many cases, for example, we cannot get members of Congress who are Republican to come on the show and talk to me because they simply don't need to. They can go to their safe outlets where they won't be challenged. And on the left, a lot of people get mad if we're not spouting talking points, basically, if we're asking tough questions of Democratic lawmakers. And this didn't mean to turn into like a poor me journalist, but what you're saying here is there's like a fundamental understanding of how the right has developed the Laura Loomer, Charlie Kirk's libs of TikTok, more fragmented bottom-up media system that the left hasn't been able to successfully develop, and that's created this misunderstanding of where we're at in our modern information system.
Yeah, misunderstanding and an asymmetry that people will say, oh, this is unfair. Well, fairness is in the eyes of the beholder, but it's certainly asymmetric, and it can be frustrating, and it can be difficult to resolve. I think there is something about the nature of right-wing populism, and its certain kinds of commitments. What we've seen is the participatory nature of these ecosystems can lead things out of control. We've talked a little bit about the influencers. We've talked a little bit about the party leaders, but the audiences in a participatory media environment have an interesting amount of power, and that power they feel as agency, which is why it keeps them revved up. It keeps them participating. And that power is, we talk about influence. Sometimes we think about the influence moves from the top to the bottom. Influencers shape what the audiences think. But in online environments, what we actually see a lot of is that the audiences shape what the influencers say and what the influencers do, because there's these feedback loops. And it's those feedback loops that can quickly shape policies. So we can already see the conspiracy theories that the audience members play with actually percolate up into some of the influencers and then into the elites. And we're actually seeing decision making happen at the elite level based on conspiracy theories that are rising from the audience. And so I think of this as like these systems with really tight levels of feedback, and right-wing populism is okay with that. It's a dangerous thing. You can see influencers get radicalized by their audiences into very kind of problematic beliefs. And it's very effective right now, but I don't know that it leads to a healthy society, right? And so we've got some interesting dynamics there that I had my slide deck, I think, back from maybe 2021 was talking about how these dynamics can spin out of control, and we see that over and over again. Right now we've got they're eating the pets kind of. Remember that they're eating the pets, like somebody sees something. They've got all this anti-immigration sentiment.
Haitian immigrants in the Midwest are eating the pets. I mean, for me, it's watching President Trump sit down with South Africa's president last week and playing basically a slideshow of stuff that would have appeared on Stormfront, on basically white nationalist outlets in the past. But this is percolated up in the right-wing influence sphere, and he's putting forward images that are either straight up not from South Africa. There were images, played that were not even in South Africa, or they were completely taken out of context, inflated. And there's been reporting on this. There is no evidence that there is some kind of white genocide going on in South Africa, but Elon Musk has tweeted it. The right-wing influencer sphere has tweeted it. And now it's setting policy when it comes to refugees who are allowed into the country. White Afrikaner refugees allowed in when other countries, that's cut off. So that we've seen the way that the rumors, the conspiracy theories, these ideas coming from white nationalism spreading to right-wing influencers, now trickling their way upwards to the Oval Office and policy in the United States. That's happening. There will be, Kate, people who listen to this and they say, sure, okay, Republican influencers are wagging the dog. They're pushing the Republican Party to the extreme. But progressive influencers, they've been distorting policy goals on the left, pushing an agenda that focuses too much on extremism of perceived structural racism or sexism, DEI redistribution goals, and that they feel like these progressive activists have been able to dictate policy in the Biden administration and in Democratic circles. What do you think about that comparison?
Well, false equivalencies are a very effective political strategy, but actually don't allow us to really get at the heart of problems and begin to address them. We've got clearly false claims and conspiracy theories that are not based in rational interpretation of the available evidence, that we can watch them percolate up and get used rhetorically and then get used to inform policy. Whether the policymaker believes them or not no longer matters. It just is used to inform policy in order to give the base more red meat and to keep the kind of machine going. And we can show you that happening over and over again in some of the right-wing discourse that we see. We have conspiracy theorists who have risen to visibility and prominence by sharing blatantly false claims, who are sitting as the head of agencies in the United States. And we can name enough, whether, national intelligence and law enforcement and health and human services. And so we can actually show that evidence. What you've given on the other side is a critique of there are certain value systems and ways of thinking about the world that the right doesn't like, and some folks on the left think are really important ways of seeing the world. And there should be conversations about where our values lie. And there's plenty, I think it is completely okay for people to have difference of opinion on those, to have conversations about that. But it's not that those ideas rest on a false foundation of conspiracy theories. They are ideas about how to see inequality in the world, inequity in the world, ways to uncover where, there are systemic biases in the world. And we can disagree on some of the causes. We can disagree on some of the remedies. But those are sort of policy discussions and value discussions. The discussions on the right, these are conspiracy theories are just they're just factually false. And so to kind of compare them and say that they're equal and say, oh, because you all have some ideologies that we don't agree with, then we can, make decisions based on false claims of white genocide in South Africa. It's just apples and oranges. These aren't two sides of the same coin. This is a false equivalence.
I'm going to use a term that might make you want to stand up and walk out of the studio, which I understand. Is this to level this asymmetry just a case where liberals have to find their own Joe Rogan? And I understand, again, if you need to walk out.
Sometimes pointing and highlighting what the problem might be doesn't necessarily lead you to what the solution might be. There is an asymmetry in these information environments. And certainly the right in 2024 benefited from an influencer ecosystem that was, that fell in line behind Donald Trump and shared content that supported him. And a lot of those folks weren't political influencers to start. They were lifestyle influencers, sports influencers, people that gained visibility based on other kinds of things in our information ecosystem, and then leveraged that to support Donald Trump. Does that mean that the left could go create one podcaster and that's going to somehow even that out? No, it's an ecosystem. There's an ecosystem on the right that has any number of dynamics. And I don't think the left can stick to its values and build a mirror image of what the right has. I think the left has to figure out how to, one, reach people, but what are you going to reach them with? What is the message? Also has to be navigated for a left to compete with what the right has right now. How do you get people involved? That participation may not be spouting conspiracy theories at influencers. Maybe that participation is more in person or local based or based around other kinds of ways of making community. Certainly, it's not going to run off of some of the same infrastructure. They're not going to take over X and have a left building sort of political movement on a platform that's owned and operated and dominated by Elon Musk, right? They're going to have to think about different infrastructure. I don't have the solution for the infrastructure that the left needs to build. I can just say that a left, if it wants to counter what's happening on the right in the United States, it needs to start laying down infrastructure that is not the same, is not a mirror image, but that works and aligns with its values and helps it get its messages out. And I also think, and this is going to be really painful to have to hear, this is not a 2-year project. This is not a 6-month, 8-month, 2-year, even 5-year project. The right, this has been a long time coming. The benefits that they saw in online media environments actually came off, there's been generations of investment in an alternative media infrastructure on the right, while the left was sort of relying on mainstream media. And I think the left in the United States is going to have to think about how do they start, not only thinking about 2026, but thinking about, long-term infrastructure investments, about how to build a political movement in a completely different time.
I'm thinking about this and thinking about what the future of that looks like. And I can't escape the fact that conspiracy theories are really attractive because they're more fun. They're more fun than facts.
They are.
And they spread more easily because they're more fun than facts.
Yep.
So if you have one party that is able to gain influence through the spread of conspiracy theories and one party that is trying to say, we're the fact-based party, is that just a doomed proposition?
I don't think it's doomed, and I think we need to shift it a little bit. I think the left needs better stories about who they are, how the different parts of the left can work together, and what they're working for. And I don't think right now they necessarily have that story worked out. Does it have to be based on a bunch of conspiracy theories? No, I think they can actually say, no, we're offering people a reality-based interpretation, and that's going to align with their values, and they're going to pull people in. But they have to figure out what they can do to communicate a future that is both realistic and both gives people promise and commitment. And it's hard right now because we've got a lot of problems. We've got a lot of real problems. We've got climate. We've got, AI coming in a really frightening way for many folks. And I think the left has to figure out how to navigate pulling people together, giving a vision of a future that they want and a pathway for getting there. And right now, the right, conspiracy theories and all, is offering a more attractive message for a lot of people. But that's not going to last forever. People are going to feel the impact of these policies that are happening right now. People are going to see, where AI might be displacing their lives and their children's future. People are going to see that a government that's mostly feeding billionaires more tax breaks and more advantages in society maybe isn't going to work for everybody. So there are opportunities there, but I think the left needs to. So it's about infrastructure and it's about message, and it's really about finding these stories that can bring people together around shared values and a shared future. Arlie Hochschild calls them deep stories, and the deep stories on the right are really powerful right now, and they're animating a really productive movement. And the left, not only does it need infrastructure, but it needs better stories.
Kate Starbird is the co-founder of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. She's also a professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. Kate, really appreciate you chatting with me, and we got into a lot of different stuff, pretty wide-ranging. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. I had no idea we were going to go in all those directions, but I'm excited to see how it turns out.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.